Welcome. I'm Hosuk Won, Technical Marketing Engineer for the Policy and Access team within the Enterprise Networking and the Cloud. I'll be guiding you through the introduction of ISE 3.1. So in case you're wondering, ISE 3.1 that I'm talking about today has not shipped yet. We're planning to release it in a few weeks, so I just wanted to make sure that you understand some or many of the information I share may change. If you happen to miss the previous two sessions, we've already covered two exciting 3.1 features, the ISE in the cloud, more specifically AWS, and tons of API enhancements. They were delivered in June and July webinar, and if you haven't reviewed them, I suggest that you do after today's session, as I'm not going to cover these two features in the next hour. Why? Because we have tons of other exciting features that we need to talk about today. I'm sure there are attendees already asking for webinar URL, so here it is on the bottom. Here you will not only find the previous sessions, but also session they were attending today will be recorded and added in a few days. So how are you going to navigate through these new exciting features today? We'll start off by reviewing the posture-related features. Then go through what we have done to address the random and changing MAC address on the mobile endpoints. Then we'll go over operational enhancements, which includes zero-touch provisioning of ISE and the upgrade enhancement. Then lastly, we'll cover other features that doesn't fit into these broad categories. Okay, so we already have the next poll question to understand which version of Linux distros you're using for the end users. So these are not for the servers. We're interested in the distro used by the end users it could be a Linux that's issued by your organization, or it could be personal devices that users bring in. And as you're answering this, Rigo, can you provide the results of the previous poll question about ISE versions in use?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Suk. So in looking at the results, I do see that most of our participants are on version 2.7, but we also do have a little bit of a surprise with the results, because for the number 2 spot, I do see that version 3.0, 2.6, and 2.4 or older are actually all tied for the number 2 spot. So yeah, that's what we have for our poll 1 results.
Oh, thank you. But it sounds like most of the customers are in the later versions. But yes, it is surprising that we still have customers who are using 2.4 and older. That's good to know. Thank you. So I suppose the poll question was hint to what is coming in 3.1. And yes, we now have posture support for Linux clients now. We also have the remediation custom script that I'll explain in detail, and two other features, which is the enhancement for discovery for the posture clients, as well as the posture bi-directional trigger in case there's some network changes and the AnyConnect doesn't realize that there has been a network change for scanning the endpoint. So the Linux is only supported with the full AnyConnect posture module. So you need to have the AnyConnect installed. And in other words, there is no temporal agent like we have for Windows and the Mac OS. We, just like any other OS support for the posture, we rely heavily on proper certificate trust. So this is between the ISE and the endpoint. So suggest using properly signed certificate, or else end users will be prompted to trust these certificates many times, and it degrades the user experience. And when I say proper certificate, it means either a publicly signed ISE certificate or proper internal PKI that's deployed on the endpoints and the ISE prior to deploying the AnyConnect posture module on the clients. So for the distros, we support Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu, and these are the versions. But these goes back a few years. So any of the past like 3 years of Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu will be supported. So before I dive into the Linux support, let's do a brief touch-up on the basics of the ISE posture. So there are two fundamental features of posture assessment. One is the checking whether the client meets the requirement, and the other one is the remediation. In case the device doesn't meet the requirements, what actions can we take? So checking is in the form of checking for installed application. Is the application running? Is the device up to date? If the anti-spyware or the malware is installed, is it up to date? Is the device encrypted? Is the volume encrypted? And there's also custom checks, like on Windows, we can check for the Windows registry keys and values. And on the Mac OS, we can also check for the contents within a property list file. On the flip side, the remediation is a different matter. Just like the checks, we provide remediation for installed and running apps, which means that if it's not installed, we can enforce installation of that app. If it's not running, then we can actually make the application run, whether via help from the user or automatically with the admin privileges. And the example of a check will be, for instance, do you have a firewall enabled on your client device? And the matching remediation is if it's not enabled, then let's help you get it enabled so that you can get on the network securely. And combined, we call this a requirement. So there's checks and remediation. And check can be multiple checks that's combined. So if you have multiple firewalls, you can check for, are any of these firewalls enabled? And then you can have a single remediation that's tied to it. So there are some dependencies based on the operating system, as well as the agent type. So there are some checks that only works on Windows and that does not work on Mac OS or on Linux. Like for instance, like registry check makes sense on Windows, but it may not on the Mac OS or Linux, right? And there is also depends on the agent type. So if you have the AnyConnect posture module, which is what we call the full client, then you have full capability of the posture assessment. Whereas if you use temporal agent, which runs within a web browser, or if you use agentless, then you'll have some limitations on what you can do in terms of checks and remediations. There's also limitations on what you can do depending on which OS you use when it comes to grace period, acceptable use policy, and posture release and whatnot. So here is a table of detailed comparison of the operating system support for checks. So as you can see, the Linux side is kind of lacking compared to Windows and Mac OS. One of the reasons is because, for instance, like application requires a Rolodex of well-known apps, and it's kind of not practical to have that for Linux because there are so many distributions out there. Whereas Windows and Mac OS is a single vendor system from Microsoft and Apple. On Linux, we can check for anti-malware, and currently we have we can do more than 30 anti-malware vendors. What this means is that we can check for whether those vendor anti-malware is installed and is it up to date. On the process, we can check for whether that process is running or not, and we can also find on the files, we can check for the date, whether the file exists, and also the checksum and hash of the file itself. Lastly, we support patch management, or technically on the Linux, it should be called like a package management. But there are four main ones that's like supported. There's the Red Hat DNF, SUSE, and GNU for both apt and yum, and VMC footprints. And all of these, we provide ways to just require the critical packages that should be installed, or maybe just the important ones, or moderate ones, or low. And you can just select how much of the package that needs to be installed before you disallow or allow network access for these endpoints. So on the flip side, previously we were just talking about the checks and that we can check for, right? Now, when it comes to the remediation, only option that we have available for the Linux is the script remediation. And I'll talk more in detail about in a few minutes after the Linux postures demo is done. But the primary reason for this is that we have a lack of UI element when you look at the Linux client compared to the Mac OS and Windows. Mainly, the Linux client shows you whether you're, on the network properly and you're going through the posture assessment on those statuses, but it can't interact with the users. There's no like a button that user can click on to scan the machine if user wants to. So only thing that you can do is the custom remediation script, and that I'll be talking about in the next section. Okay, so with that, let's do a quick demo on what the user experience looks like on the Linux posture client. Okay, so I have the Ubuntu Linux, and here you'll see the AnyConnect posture module already up and running, and right now it's not connected to the network. And as you go through the setup, I'm actually using the remediation script option. So you'll see some pop-ups depending on what requirement is present on the policy. In this case, I'm trying to make sure that all the packages that needs to be on the machine is up to date. So here I'm going to connect to the secure SSID that's using 802.1x. And automatically, as soon as the AnyConnect finds out the ISE instance out there, it will open up the software tool to make sure that the client is up to date. And then through that, the user can interact with it and update it. And once it's up to date, then you will be compliant and you'll be provided network access. And in case you haven't noticed, I also have a script that was also creating a test file on the user's home folder. So I'll explain a little bit more better in the Windows example, but you'll see that there's a lot of power in the custom remediation script compared to the other methods that we have for remediation. But here's the demo of the Linux posture experience. Okay, so aside from the custom executable option, Cisco needs to keep up with newly introduced applications and new versions of such applications, right? Now, while Cisco team strives to be up to date, it is not always on point. Also, there may be some custom applications that Cisco will never support because like in-house built applications that you have, right? So as a security admin, there's a need to remediate issues that causes the endpoint to be a non-compliant and move the endpoints to the compliant state, right? So that they can be on the network and do their job. In a organization which, with thousands of endpoints or users, this needs to be done automatically without, you as an admin being involved. So as I mentioned, since ISE doesn't always support built-in remediation options, admin needs to have a flexibility, right? And this is where the custom remediation script comes into play. This script option helps, you to add some flexibility so that you don't need to wait for any unsupported remediations, right? So if there's a new version of like some software that you want to, bring up, then you don't have to wait for the ISE or the Cisco to provide support for that application or anti-malware. You can create your script on your own and then take advantage of that. So what is supported? On the Windows, we're going to be using the PowerShell script. And on the Mac OS and Linux, we'll be using the shell script. And in this case, it's only supported on the full AnyConnect agent. So if you have to use the AnyConnect posture module, it is not supported on the clientless, nor the temporal agent. So how does it actually work? So there's the client device. You need to have the AnyConnect installed already. If it's not, then ISE will force you to install it. And there are obviously network devices. It doesn't really matter whether you're connecting through wireless, wired, or VPN. And of course, you need ISE. So endpoint will connect to the network. And as you've seen from the Linux example, as soon as you connect, the AnyConnect will find the ISE on the network, and then it will establish trust. And that's why the certificate is very important. And once that trust has been established, the AnyConnect client will download the script to be run. And then it will also verify the hash of the script to make sure that it hasn't been tampered with. And then once that's done, it will run the script and remediate the machine as it connects to the network. Okay, so with that, let's do a quick demo on the custom remediation script. Okay, in this case, it's going to be a Windows. And you'll see the custom remediation script options in the results. And if you go to posture and remediation actions, there's a new option called script. And here I have 3 of them I have created, 2 for Windows and 1 for Linux that you've seen before. And I'll show you some details on what it looks like for the Windows disable spooler remediation. So let me just pause the video for a second here. So as you know, there's the print nightmare vulnerability that's out there, right? And many customers are trying to find out ways to disable the spooler service on Windows. And this is a very easy, like trivial thing that you can do now with Windows, with ISE. As the endpoints are connecting, you can check to see if the spooler is up and running. And if it is, then you can use the script capability on ISE to stop it and also disable the service so that it doesn't run anymore. And here you have select the which operating system you want to run on. We support again Windows, Mac OS, and Linux. And on the remediation type, you can either do automatic or manual. Again, automatic allows you to run just automatically without any user intervention. If it's manual, then there will be a button that says, "Hey, user, can you click this button so it can be remediated?" And this is only available on the Mac OS and Windows. But again, Linux, you don't have a UI element for buttons, right? So you can't do that. So only automatic is possible on Linux. And then depending on the OS, in this case, Windows, you have PowerShell. And in the case of Linux and Mac OS, you'll have just a shell script. And you can upload the file, and I'll show you an example of what the file looks like. And then the next setting is, how do you want to, address the PowerShell policy? So bypass means that you're not going to care about what the policy is set up on the endpoint. You're just going to run. The all signed means that the PowerShell script has to be signed before it can be run. None means that we'll just inherit whatever policy that's set up on the client itself. And you can also control which user that you'll be running it on. You can either run it as an administrator that you use to install the AnyConnect, or you can also use the privilege of the logged in user. Okay, and let me show you what the script looks like. Here I have a very simple script. I have a variable with the service name spooler. And then the first action is I'm taking the variable and then stopping that service. And then I'm also going to the set service category, the characteristics, so that it's disabled from now on. So 2 things, right? I'm stopping the service, I'm disabling it so that it doesn't come up anymore on that machine, even if it's rebooted. And then the other thing that I'm doing just for fun is I'm adding a file on the user's desktop called a spooler disable text. So I can kind of visually see that it happened on the endpoint as I go through the demo. And by the way, I happened to upgrade the environment to the Windows 11 for some testing. So that's why I'm using Windows 11 here, but it works on Windows 10, of course. So here I'm just confirming that the Windows spooler is up and running. And I have the AnyConnect open up on the bottom. And then I'm going to connect to the secure SSID. And as I connect, just like the Linux, it's going to find the ISE on the network and then download the policies and start the scanning. And I set it to automatic, so it will, automatically disable the service, stop it, and then create the file. And as you can see, the file has been created on the left side. And once this is done, user will get full network access. It's going to refresh the screen to make sure that the policy has been taken in effect. So as you can see, it's been disabled and stopped. Now let me show you what the logs looks like on ISE. So starting with the live log, you can see that initially I was posture redirected and the posture status is pending. And then the blank line above is the change of authorization. And after that, I get permit access with the compliant. And then I can also go into the reports and see all the details about the actual client that connected. Yeah, so the only reason I still shows as Windows 10 is because ICE doesn't know about existence of Windows 11, so it just thinks that it's a Windows 10, but it is Windows 11 actually that I used. And there's a script remediation specific log that we also have that shows whether that script was run properly or not for each of the files. Okay, so that was a demo on the remediation scripts. And let me just show you some other features that we have added on the posture side. Next one is the discovery backup serverless. So when the AnyConnect connects to the network, right? If it sees that there is a network change or transition, it's going to start sending discovery packet to the default gateway, the discovery host if it's configured on the profile, and the enroll.cisco.com, which is hard-coded, and all the PSNs that it knows of. And as you can see, if it does that every time it connects, it's going to create quite a bit of traffic. So we now have a new option where you can configure a list of PSNs that will be used for discovery. So instead of all the PSNs that AnyConnect knows, you can designate one or two that will be used for discovery. The other feature that we have added is the posture bi-directional trigger. So in a very rare occasion, when you're using a non-VLAN based quarantining, then you will run into this issue. So let me talk about the quarantine, right? If you use quarantine VLAN, there's a obvious change of IP address as you transition from the access VLAN to quarantine VLAN and back and forth, right? So every time that happens, AnyConnect will rescan the machine to make sure that the policy has been applied. Now, what if you're using ACL? So if you're using ACL for quarantining, there is no IP change. And there are certain times where the AnyConnect may not realize that the network has changed. So there it may be in a limbo where AnyConnect thinks that it's on a full network access. However, the reality is that ICE is saying that you're in a quarantine state. And that's what we're trying to address. So when the AnyConnect comes up, even when it's in like access state, it's going to keep probing the ICE to find out if that status is still true. And if that status changes to pending, meaning that it's no longer compliant, and then it will just go ahead and rescan the device and then make sure that it's compliant and get it back on the network. So the settings are here. Again, you can set up the interval on how often that you want to send probe, and you can also select which PSNs that you'll be using for those probing requests. Okay, so with that, let's take another poll question. So it will be about the random MAC. So what is the main concern with random MAC address for your organization? And while you're answering the question, Rigo, if you could give us the result of the previous question about Linux distro.
Yeah, absolutely. So in looking at the results, I do see that most end users are not using Linux. But for those who are using Linux distro, the results show that a good number are using Ubuntu on the network. And next, we also have those who are using other.
Okay, thank you very much. That seems to be consistent with what our thoughts are. But if you do use the Linux endpoints, now you have an option. Okay. So let's talk about the random MAC address. So I'll go through what the issue is, how it impacts the MDM and BYOD flow, what the solution is, and I'll also have a description of how it works across other products within Cisco, including DNA Center, DNA Spaces, and even the wireless controllers. And I'll explain that in that slide. So how is the random MAC implemented? So on the Windows 10, there's a global setting that you can enable random MAC, but you can also use it per SSID. And you can even change the MAC address every day if you want to for a given SSID. On the Android 10 and 11, it's enabled by default. The good news is that even though it's enabled by default, once you create a profile or wireless settings for a given SSID, it will be using that same MAC address or same random MAC, even if you delete the SSID and recreate it. And this is the same for the iOS 14. So iOS 14 calls it private address, but again, just like the Android, as long as you're not like a factory resetting the device, it's going to keep using the same MAC address for a given SSID. However, on the Android 10 or 11 and 12, there is a developer option that user can enable called the Wi-Fi non-persistent MAC randomization, which means that every time you connect, the different random MAC will be generated and used for that SSID, and which is very similar to changing daily option on the Windows. So what does the random MAC address look like? So this is the MAC address, and if you look at the first octet, there's the and the octet, so it has the 8 bits. The second from the last 8 bit, it designates whether the MAC address is globally unique, meaning that it's OUI enforced or locally administered. OUI enforced means that it's a actually unique ID that's unique for that device. If it's set to 1, then these are locally administered that you can change on your own, right? So anytime you see a random MAC, it follows this guidance. So if you look at this MAC address, which of these I think is the random MAC? And I'll give an answer in this case. Actually, all of them are random MAC address. They're easy to kind of find out because based on this rule, if the first octet ends with 2, 6, or A and E, that means that this is a random MAC. And based on that, you have 64 combinations of random MAC address and like prefix that you can have. So how does this impact the ISE features? So on the ISE BYOD, we have something called a dual SSID flow. You have 2 SSIDs. One is open, and the other one is not the secure SSID in general. And as you can imagine, you connect first to the SSID, open SSID, and you'll be given a 1 MAC address. However, when ISE sees that, ISE will issue that MAC, the certificate for that endpoint, and then embed the MAC address in the certificate, so that endpoint can be tied to that MAC address, right? However, when the user moves to the secure SSID and use that certificate that's been issued, now guess what? There's a new MAC address that's been generated for the new SSID. And that MAC address that ISE sees on the session does not match the one on the certificate. So the user will not be able to get on the network. And there's workaround, to address this. But, in essence, you have a mismatching MAC address between the certificate and the user. In the case of the ISE integration with the MDM, we also have similar issues, right? So let's say the user is enrolling the device while the user is on cellular network to the MDM or EMM. It's obviously going to use the real MAC address that's on the device. And later on, when the user is actually connecting to the wireless network at your office, it's going to use a different MAC address. And ISE will look up that MAC address on the MDM to find out if the device is compliant. When it looks up, it's going to use the MAC address that's been learned through the secure SSID, and that will not be present on the MDM because it's not a known MAC address. So at this point, the endpoint will be forced to re-enroll their device or get denied access. So what is the solution for this? In the case of MDM or EMM issue, we have introduced what's called a GUID, globally unique ID. And it depends on which entity is generating the UID, the unique ID. It will look very different. In this case, this is an example of the one that's generated by ISE itself. But if you have like a mobile iron or Intune that's generating the unique ID, you can base the unique ID based on the IMEI or some MEID that's present on the mobile device, and then it can be embedded into actual certificate. So here's an example of the mobile iron device that's using the like one of the unique IDs. And once this has been generated and ISE is aware of this unique ID, instead of using the MAC address, then this unique ID can be used to look up for the endpoint status. So now we have some like agreement among the ISE endpoint and the MDM to find out which, what the unique ID is for that given endpoint, regardless of where the user is. And we have a new option to use that unique ID for lookups, but you can also have a fallback in case there is no UID, and you can fall back to the MAC address as usual. In the case of the BYOD, we have very similar option where now in the certificate template, instead of just generating the MAC address, we can also generate MAC address and the GUID. So as user connects, it's going to get a certificate. And then when it connects to the secure SID, now it will not only have the MAC address, but also the unique ID that's been generated for the endpoint and use that for the BYOD flow. Okay, now that you've seen some how we address on the ISE itself for MDM and BYOD, let's look at the random and changing MAC solution. So you already know that we have integration with the MDM and EMM vendors, right? So for now, we have the Microsoft Intune and the mobile iron that has updated API to use the GUID. And along with that, MDM also provides the compliance status, right? Is the pin lock enabled? Is it encrypted? Those kinds of things. And it will also issue certificate and the Wi-Fi profile using that GUID. And it will be embedded into the actual certificate. But what about other things, right? There's ISE, there's the wireless controller, DNA center with the endpoint analytics, and also DNA spaces. And of course, the ISE is center of this. ISE will generate the GUID for BYOD flow, as you've seen. And as you go through the BYOD flow, ISE will also generate the certificate and the Wi-Fi profile for the endpoint. But it will also share that GUID via radius accept to the controller and the pxGrid for DNA center and the other systems. And it has a new UI element, so it can show you the random MAC. And you can also place random MAC devices, meaning that you can deny them if you want to. On the wireless controller, you also have the visibility. So the random MAC will be seen with a different icon that shows that it's a random MAC. Well, you can also deny, there's a checkbox on the SSID that you can deny random MAC devices if you want to. And just like ISE, it also shares the random MAC that it learned, or the GUID it learned from ISE to the DNA spaces using the NMSP. And it can also share that to the DNA center and the endpoint analytics using the telemetry. And then the DNA center and the DNA spaces will have visibility of the random MAC and the GUID as well. Okay, so with that, let me do a demo on the random and the changing MAC address. In this case, I'm showing you the demo of the BYOD flow. Okay, so I have the ISE here, and the endpoint I'll be using is a iPhone that's running the iOS 14, and I'll show you how the ISE is generating the GUID for this as part of the BYOD flow. Okay, first I'm going to show you the certificate template that has the GUID option along with the MAC address. Okay, as you can see, there's a GUID option that's been selected. And now I'm going to go through the BYOD flow on this endpoint. I'm using a single SSID flow, so I'm going to connect to the secure SSID. It's going to ask me to trust the ISE certificate so they can send the credentials. And then have an IP address, and then I get redirected to the ISE portal page. And then I'll give it a name. And then it will download the profile that makes me trust the ISE certificate first. And once this is done, it's also going to download a secondary profile that includes the Wi-Fi settings and the actual certificate, signing request for the SCEP process so that I can get the certificate downloaded on this device. And this is where the actual certificate is being generated on the device and gets signed by ISE. Okay, and let me just show you what the GUID looks like on this device. And it's in the SAN field, subject alternative name. And as you can see, there's the email address, shows the MAC address, and the URI is the actual GUID. And let me connect to the actual SSID so I can show you the GUID in the ISE live log. Okay, now it's connecting with the actual certificate that's been issued on the endpoint. Okay, so on the live log, you can see that initially I connected as a NSP onboard, and I was using the PIP MSR version 2, providing the username and password manually. And then second time, I was connecting using the certificate that's been issued for my device. So I'm using the EPTLS, that signifies that I'm using the actual certificate. And then as I go down, you'll see that there's a SAN field that includes the actual GUID that's been generated for this client. And then lastly, on the actual live log view, you'll see the GUID visible for once I started using it based on the certificate. Okay, so with that, let me go back to the slide. Okay, so the next poll question, how do you upgrade your ISE deployments, as you move from the older to the newer version? And while you're answering that question, Rigo, can you give us the result from the previous question about random MAC?
Yeah, absolutely. So previous question was, what is the main concern with random MAC? And security was the major concern out of this list, but others had did have concerns about lack of control, as well as random MAC filling up the database. Those two were actually tied for the number 2 spot.
Oh, thank you very much. So hopefully the section that I went through the random MAC, what we have done so far will give you some better feeling about what we can do in terms of controlling random MAC. But let me move on to the zero-touch provisioning and the upgrade. So with the ISE 3.1, we, realization of the ISE policy management and the lifecycle orchestration is now possible. And if you look at the lifecycle, right, where you want to have a deployment of ISE without any human interaction, you can do so now. And you start out by zero-touch provisioning, and then once the API has been enabled, you can deal with certificates and actually go through the deployment automation, meaning that you can connect the ISE instances together and make an actual deployment. Once that's done, you can also create the policies, manage the licenses, and do backup and restore. Now, granted, there are some things that you still have to wait for the patch 1, but the first thing that needs to happen is the zero-touch provisioning. What it means is that you need to be able to run the instances in the first place with an IP address, right? You need to have a credential that's embedded in as an instance comes up. So you need to have a box that comes up with the right version, with the right credentials, with the API enabled, so you can run all of the other API calls to make this happen. So in terms of zero-touch provisioning, there are 3 deployment types that we have, right? So we have the SNS appliance that has the CIMC, the Cisco Integrated Management Controller, and you have the VMware that you may be using for virtual deployments. And now you have a new option with the AWS. Now, in terms of the VMware and the AWS, you can use the native APIs to bring up a ISE VM or an ISE instance. And you can even designate, which username, with what kind of password, whether you're using a public key or for SSH, that can be done using this APIs. However, on appliances, right, there is no API aside from the CIMC, right? So you have to use this to bring up an instance and provide that configuration for IP address, DNS, and host name and whatnot. So what you do is we have something called a configuration file that you can add as a ISO or image file and mount it on the as you boot up the ISE ISO file. And this option is possible for CIMC or the SNS appliance as well as the ESXi. However, for the ESXi, we still recommend using the APIs that they have instead of this method because it's much easier. So what does this ISO or image file look like? Well, if you install the ISE manually, right, you get a series of questions about host name, IP address, netmask and gateway, DNS, and those are pretty much what's inside the image file as a configuration. So along with that, we have added a few more where you can even install the patches through repository that you have set up. So as you bring up the ISE instance through the ZTP, you can actually patch it as well. But also we can enable the SSH and the ERS API, open APIs along with it, so you can take further actions as the instance comes up. But this is pretty much what goes into that image file or image, that you'll be mounting onto the CIMC. So what does it look like? You'll be obviously using APIs to automate this, but once you do this, you'll mount the main ISO file for ISE itself, and then secondarily, you'll mount the image file that I just talked about for the configuration. And as the ISO file boots up, it's going to take the configuration for the image file and then bring up the instance per your requirement. And same thing that you can do on the VMware. You can have mount 2 CD DVD drives, one for ISO itself and the one for ISE image file. And if you're going to monitor this with a serial console, you'll notice that the 4th option is where it will bring up the instance through the ZTP, and then it will just time out if there is no user interaction. And if there is a file in the image file or the configuration in the image file, then it will take it and then bring up a new ISE with the like a factory reset ISE at that point. Okay, now let's talk about the upgrade. Split upgrade is what we had for a long time. So this is where you can upgrade using the 5-step method. But in general, when we allow upgrade to ISE, we have been supporting the 3 previous versions. So in the case of 3.1, that means you can upgrade from 3.0, 2.7, and all the way down from the 2.6. And of course, if you have 2.4 or older, you need to have interim upgrade, right? So you'll be upgrading 2.4 to 3.0 and then 3.1. But we only support the 3 previous versions. So this is still possible. However, we have introduced a new option called the full upgrade. And the full upgrade is a 2-step process, and it's much quicker. And because it requires some changes, you need to have latest patch installed on the 3.0, 2.7, and 2.6. And by the way, if you're a federal customer, the previous version that was certified for federal use was the 2.6. And if you want to move to the next version, the 3.1 will be certified in at some point. And this is the version that you'll be using for the federally certified ISE. And the other thing that I want to mention is that the SNS 3515 is no longer supported with the 3.1. So 3500 series, we have two appliances. One is the 3515, which has 12 cores and the 16 GB RAM. And that has, that doesn't have the resource that it needs to run the 3.1. So we are dropping support for that. However, the 3595 is still supported. So we're only dropping the 3515 out of the 3500 series. So let me just explain what the previous split upgrade process looks like, and then I'll explain what the new full upgrade process looks like and how it's better. So first what you do is the secondary PAN on a deployment, right? So this is a distributed deployment. So you have the primary admin node, secondary admin node, and the primary MNT, secondary MNT, and a bunch of PSN instances, right? The first thing that you'll do is secondary admin node will become a primary admin node in a new upgraded deployment. And then now you have the admin node available. You'll move the primary MNT, and it still becomes the primary MNT on the new deployment. And then you'll move the rest of the PSNs, how many that you have. And then you'll move the secondary MNT. And the last thing to move is the primary admin node. It will become a secondary admin node. Of course, you can promote it back so that it becomes the primary admin node if you want to. But because it's a 5-step process, at the worst case, it's going to take quite a bit of time. The new full upgrade process is 2-step. First, you'll upgrade the primary admin node, and it becomes a primary admin node on the new deployment. And then you'll just bulk upgrade rest of the nodes. And just because it's a 2-step process, it's much quicker than the split upgrade option that we had. And we do a extensive list of checklists and validations so that you don't run into any issues as you go through the upgrade process. Okay, so with that, let's do another poll question. Which SAML identity provider are you using? And Rigo, if you could give us the result of a previous question.
Yes, thank you, Hosuk. So the previous question was, as a reminder, how do you upgrade your ISE deployment? And the top upgrade method is ISE standard GUI. So that seems to work well for a good number of participants. But the results also show that the ISE standard CLI and backup and restore with tandem deployment are also favorite ways of upgrading.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. Okay, so let's talk about additional 3.1 features. So these are the ones that I couldn't really put them into different categories that I had before. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through every one of them, but just know that there are quite a bit of features that we have added. The first feature I want to talk about in this section is the admin single sign-on. So previously, you can do admin login using the internal database, AD, Radius, but now you can also use the SAML identity provider for the admin login. So we have validated the Azure AD, Ping, and the Okta, but any SAML 2.0 compliant IDP should work. Next one is the Active Directory Lockout Prevention. So imagine a scenario where you have a policy on AD that says if you type in wrong password more than 5 times, and your account will be locked out. Well, you don't only have one device, right? The PC is not the only one that's connected to the network and using your username and password. You may have a tablet, you might have a phone that's also using the Wi-Fi and using your credentials. So even if you change the PC password to use the proper one, your phone or the tablet maybe still be using the old password and then get your account locked out. So what we have done is, if you enable this option, it's going to first, as you connect, it's going to look at your account to find out if your bad password count is still lower than what we had enabled, so it doesn't lock you out before attempting the actual authentication. And if you notice that the bad password count isn't high, it's below the threshold that we have set up, then we'll go through the authentication properly. If not, then we'll just unconditionally send a reject to the client so that you're not locking out for the other, in case that you're going to log in with other methods. The other enhancements that we made is on the context visibility. So what was happening is, context visibility, as you may know, has the details of all the things considered for a MAC address. So if you have thousands of MAC address, it has all the details about how he authenticated, all the profiles that he has learned, such as the HCP, radius, and the CDP and whatnot. And when you export that database out of ISE, it's going to have about 100 attributes for a given MAC address. And let's say you want to update the database, so you modify some of the settings, and you try to re-import that data, the CSV back into ISE. Well, ISE is going to reject it because there are some fields that you will not be able to import back in, even though it can be exported out. So we have a new option where when you're exporting it out with the intention of importing it back in, then you can select the importable only. And it will just export out what the fields that ISE will accept as import option as well. The other feature that we have added is the logical profile Dashlet. Previously, you can only see the endpoints based on the profiles within that dashboard, but now you can customize and put the endpoints into the different logical profiles. So if you have workstations, and you can lump in all the Linux, Mac OS, and Windows desktops in there, and then create a workstation logical profile. And maybe you can create one for mobile devices, for Androids and iPhones. And then once you have done that, then they'll show up as different category within the logical profile dashlet. Next one is the Android BYOD streamlined experience. So Android requires a helper application, what we call the Network Setup Assistant, to be downloaded from the Android Play Store. And one of the things that has happened in the past few years is, for the Android devices, we've been using the EST for certificate like assignments provisioning instead of the SCEP. And when you use EST, which is a much secure protocol, it requires an additional check for proof of identity. However, it also meant that user is now prompted twice for the network password. So of course, user will be prompted to provide the username and password as you go through the BYOD flow. But as user opens the app again, user is going to prompt it again for the same password. It was confusing a lot of users. I mean, let's face it, right? I mean, we, as a admin, we have the certificate is very hard to understand concept, and you can't imagine, how much complex this looks like to the users, right? When they have to deal with certificates that they don't do every day. So that was one option that we are addressing, and the other part is the public cert that ISE also issues. That needs to be added to the certificate store on the Android. And this screen didn't really make any sense, right? User will just like okay anyways, and it will work. And so we have an option to either eliminate this screen for the, okay, it's not an option. It's already eliminated once you use the latest version of the setup assistant. And then we made it optional for the EST by not asking this question if you're using SCEP. So you have two options. If you want security, then you can use EST with the proof of identity, but it will ask the user twice for the network password. However, if you want better user experience, you can revert back to SCEP, and that means that this screen will not show up for the end users. So they only need to enter the username and password just once. So this is how we kind of made it easier to deal with for the BYOD flow for Androids. Okay, next one is more of a public service announcement. But with the 3.1, we are dropping the support for the pxGrid 1.0. So it was just not scalable compared to the 2.0, and 2.0 has been there for a while. So anything that you're doing with the 1.0 will not be supported as soon as you upgrade to 3.1. The good news is that if you're using Cisco products and you're using the latest version of their products, then the 2.0 is already enabled on those products. But if you are using third-party products, I would say many of them are already on 2.0. But if not, then please let us know which ones are not. But we have a information on this link where you can find out which of the third-party ecosystem partners are using the 2.0 versus 1.0. And if you're also using some in-house app leveraging the pxGrid, make sure to use the 2.0 instead of 1.0 as well. Okay, so with that, I'm going to splash the resource page. But Rigo, do you want to give us the result of the last poll question?
Yeah, absolutely. So for our fifth and final poll, so which SAML identity provider are you using? I do see that Azure AD is the clear winner here in terms of how many are using it, but ADFS is also very close behind, as well as Okta.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so here are some resources that you can use, including the future webinars that you can review, including the one that we're presenting today. And if you want to try out the ISE, there is a great resource where you can go to the ISE and DevNet, and there's a free sandbox to even run ISE and even leverage the APIs to find out what you can do with ISE 3.1. Okay, I know we're kind of close on time, but I'll just open up for any questions that hasn't been answered yet. Rigo?
Hey, Hosuk, so thank you so much for that great presentation. In looking at our Q&A panel, I do see one question remaining, and our panelists have done an amazing job of clearing out the queue, so thank you so much for that. But for our last question here, the user is asking, is it easier with SEP, but what's the trade-off by not using EST?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. EST, in the context of the BYOD, I would say there is not much of a difference because ISE provides the POI even for SCEP based on the user login. But EST in general provides a much better security in terms of the actual the certificate issuance. But I would say it's very minimal, and that's why we introduced the SCEP to streamline the user experience. But yes, so I guess I hope the question is yes, there is some benefits, but it will be minimal in the context of the ISE BYOD.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Hosuk.